I was 13 years old and home alone for the first time. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me in charge of the house. I was excited to have some freedom and independence, but also a little nervous about being alone in the house. It was around 8 p.m. when I received a phone call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should answer it. But curiosity got the best of me, and I picked up the phone. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound confident. "Hi, is this the homeowner?" a man's voice asked. I found it strange that someone would call me and ask if I was the homeowner, but I decided to play along and replied, "Yes, this is the homeowner." The man on the other end of the line introduced himself as a salesman for a security company. He asked if my parents were home, and I told him they were out of town. He then proceeded to ask if our house had a security system. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to reveal any information to a stranger. But then I remembered that we didn't have a security system, so I answered truthfully, "No, we don't have a security system." "Okay," the man said before abruptly hanging up the phone. I felt a little uneasy after the phone call, but I shrugged it off and went back to watching TV. However, a few minutes later, I realized my mistake. I had just told a stranger that my parents were not home and that our house was not protected by a security system. My heart started racing as I quickly got up and checked all the locks on the doors and windows. I made sure they were all secure before grabbing a kitchen knife and locking myself in my bedroom. I lived in a dead-end street, so I felt relatively safe, but it was a work day, and most of my neighbors were not home. I tried to calm myself down by telling myself that it was probably just a sales call and nothing to worry about. But then, I noticed a van parked down the road that I didn't recognize. It was a dark, unmarked van with tinted windows. I kept my eyes on it, feeling a sense of unease wash over me. I watched as the van sat there for around 20 minutes, with no one getting in or out. And then, without warning, it drove away. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that someone had been inside the van the entire time, watching my house. I was now convinced that something was not right. I didn't know who the man on the phone was or why he was asking about our security system. And now, there was a suspicious van parked outside my house. I tried to think of what to do next. I didn't want to call the police and cause a scene if it turned out to be nothing, but I also didn't want to ignore the situation and put myself in danger. As I was contemplating my next move, I heard a noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone was trying to open the front door. My heart started racing as I realized that someone was trying to break into my house. I quickly grabbed my phone and called my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. She lived 2 houses down and was a retired police officer. I explained the situation to her, and she told me to stay put and lock myself in my room. She said she would be right over. I followed her instructions and locked my bedroom door. I could hear someone moving around downstairs, and I was terrified. I didn't know if it was the man from the phone call or someone else, but I knew I needed to stay calm and be ready to defend myself if necessary. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard Mrs. Jenkins' voice outside my door. She had called the police, and they were on their way. I cautiously unlocked my door and opened it to see Mrs. Jenkins standing there with a police officer. They searched the house and found no signs of a break-in, but they did find a window in the back of the house that had been tampered with. The police took a report and told me to call them if I noticed anything else suspicious. Mrs. Jenkins stayed with me until my parents came home later that night. It turned out that the man on the phone was a scam artist trying to gather information about our house to potentially break in, and the van parked outside was most likely his accomplice, waiting for the right time to strike. So, this happened to me a few years ago when I was home alone, sick from school. I was feeling pretty miserable, but I was craving some ramen noodles, so I dragged myself downstairs to the kitchen to cook some up. As I was waiting for the water to boil, I got a call from my mom. She sounded really urgent and said she was coming home right away. I was a little worried and asked her what was wrong, but she just said she couldn't talk and hung up. I was a bit confused, but I figured she must have forgotten something important and needed to come back home. I went back to cooking my noodles, but then I heard the phone ring again. It was my mom, and she sounded really confused. She asked me why I had called her and said she hadn't called me. I was even more confused now. Did I imagine the call? Was I so sick that I was hallucinating? Just as I was trying to figure out what was going on, I heard a loud knocking on the sliding glass door in the dining room. I froze, not knowing what to do. I slowly walked towards the door and peeked through the blinds. My heart was pounding in my chest as I saw a man standing outside, looking through the blinds. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was wearing a hoodie, and it looked like he was trying to hide his face. I was terrified. I had no idea who this guy was or what he wanted. I quickly backed away from the door and ran upstairs to my room. My mind was racing with all sorts of thoughts. Was this guy trying to break into my house? Was he going to hurt me? I needed to call my mom and get her to come home right away. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number, but she didn't answer. I left her a panicked voicemail, telling her about the guy at the door and begging her to come home as soon as possible. I was shaking with fear and didn't know what to do. I was home alone and didn't have anyone to protect me. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard a car pull up in the driveway. I peeked out my window and saw my mom's car. I ran downstairs and unlocked the door for her. She came in, looking worried and confused. I quickly explained everything to her and she called the police. The police arrived within minutes and searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. They told us to be on high alert and to call them if anything else happened. My mom stayed home with me for the rest of the day, and we made sure all the doors and windows were locked. To this day, I have no idea who that guy was or what he wanted. It still gives me chills thinking about it. I'm just glad I had the sense to call my mom and that she came home right away. It's scary to think about what could have happened if I hadn't been home or if I hadn't been paying attention. It all started about a year or two ago, when I still had my old slider phone. I was just minding my own business when I got a random call from an unknown number. I answered it, thinking it might be one of my friends, but instead I heard a voice asking for a girl named Sarah. I was confused because I didn't know any Sarah, so I told them they had the wrong number, and they immediately hung up. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it started happening more frequently. About once or twice a week, I would get these calls asking for Sarah. Sometimes they would even call me at 3 a.m. It was starting to get really annoying, and I couldn't understand why they kept calling me. I tried blocking the numbers, but they always seemed to call from a different one. I even changed my number, but that didn't stop the calls either. It was like they were determined to reach Sarah through me. One day, I got another call, and as usual, I told them they had the wrong number. But this time, I decided to do something different. After they hung up, I went to my call history and hit redial. But instead of calling the number back, a strange machine voice came on and said that the number did not exist. I was so confused. How could I just receive a call from a number that didn't exist? I started to get curious and went through my call history to call back some of the other numbers that had called me. But every single one of them had the same result. A machine telling me the number did not exist. I was starting to get a little freaked out. I decided to do some investigating and Googled the numbers. To my surprise, they were all coming from North Dakota. I didn't know anyone from there, so I couldn't figure out why they were calling me. The next time I got a call asking for Sarah, I had had enough. I decided to play along and said, "Oh yeah, she's right here." The person on the other end of the line immediately responded, "No, she isn't," and hung up. I was shocked. Who was this Sarah? And why were so many people trying to reach her through me? To this day, I still don't know the answer. I have stopped receiving those calls, but I can't help but wonder what was going on. Was it some kind of prank? Or was Sarah in some kind of trouble and people were trying to reach her through any means possible?